A teenage boy is buried under a mound in southern Germany with gold at his wrists and a bronze couch beneath him. 200 kilometers away, in Dorset, England, a woman is buried in a cemetery where almost everyone shares her mother's bloodline going back for centuries. Across the Channel in France and across the sea in Ireland, people are speaking dialects of the same language family, carving the same swirling art into their metalwork, burying their dead with strikingly similar rituals. For 200 years, historians called all of these people by one name: Celts, one culture, one people, one sweeping tribe that supposedly rolled across Europe like a wave. And for 200 years, nobody could actually check if that was true. Now, geneticists can, and what they found in the bones is not the story anyone expected. This is not a fringe theory. It is not a documentary hunch dressed up as science. The findings come from peer-reviewed papers published in Nature and Nature Human Behavior, produced by some of the most well-resourced ancient DNA labs on the planet. The lab of David Reich at Harvard, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and the Department of Genetics at Trinity College Dublin. These are not people chasing headlines. They are the same researchers who have spent the last decade rewriting the genetic history of Europe, one skeleton at a time. And when they turned their instruments toward the Celts, the assumption that had stood since the 19th century, that Celtic meant a single bloodline, did not survive contact with the data. Here's the concept you need before any of this makes sense, and it is simpler than it sounds. Think about the term Latin America. Everyone from Mexico to Argentina speaks a language descended from Latin. They share food traditions, religious practices, art styles that echo across the whole region. But nobody would claim that a Mexican farmer and an Argentine rancher share some unique Latin American gene that sets them apart from everyone else on Earth. They are connected by language and culture, not by blood. That is the exact confusion that built up around the word Celtic for to buy in winter centuries. Ancient Greek writers coined the term Keltoi around the 6th century BCE to describe peoples living across a huge stretch of Europe. And later, historians folded language, art style, and ancestry into one tidy package, as if speaking a Celtic language automatically meant belonging to a single Celtic bloodline. Ancient DNA cannot read a single word these people spoke, but it can read exactly who their parents were. And that is where this story splits wide open. So let's go back to the beginning, just to where the story any encyclopedia would tell you starts. Iron Age Europe, roughly 800 to 100 BCE, and a set of connected cultures archaeologists call Hallstatt and Laten, named after the sites in Austria and Switzerland where their artifacts were first identified. From the Iberian Peninsula in the west to Anatolia in the east, from the British Isles to the Alps, people were adopting strikingly similar swirling art, similar sword styles, similar burial customs, and languages that belonged to the same family tree. The old explanation was migration on a grand scale, a Celtic homeland somewhere in Central Europe, expanding outward, planting genetically related populations everywhere the culture appears in the archaeological record. It's a clean story. IT fits neatly on a museum wall map with big sweeping arrows. The problem is that nobody had the tools to test it until sequencing technology matured enough to pull usable genomes out of 2,000-year-old bone. Now they do. And the arrows on that map needed serious redrawing. In the next part of this, we go straight into the first place those redrawn arrows point: Britain, in a single genome sequencing effort so large it changed the terms of the debate on its own. In 2022, a team led by Harvard geneticists Nick Patterson and David Reich, working alongside more than 200 archaeologists and geneticists across Europe, published a study in the journal Nature that had been years in the making. They generated genome-wide data from 793 individuals, increasing the available ancient DNA data from the Middle to Late Bronze Age and Iron Age in Britain 12-fold, and for Western and Central Europe 3.5 times over. 793 individual human genomes, pulled from petrous bones and tooth roots, spanning centuries of British prehistory. That is not a sample. That is close to a census of the dead. Here's what they found buried inside that data. Between roughly 1000 and 875 BCE, ancestry linked to early European farmers increased sharply in southern Britain, in what we now call England and Wales, but not in Scotland. The shift traces back to migrants who arrived at that time and in the centuries before, people who were genetically closest to populations then living in France. This wasn't a trickle. These migrants ended up contributing roughly half the ancestry of people living in England and Wales by the Iron Age, making them a plausible vector for how early Celtic languages actually reached Britain. Half. Think about that the way you'd think about your own family tree. One of your two parents, genetically speaking, tracing straight back across the English Channel from France, arriving not in some legendary single invasion, but in a centuries-long wave that mostly nobody wrote down, because nobody in Bronze Age Britain was writing anything down at all. Now stretch that same number across time. If you lined up every generation between that Bronze Age migration and the Roman conquest of Britain, roughly 40 to 50 generations, the genetic fingerprint of those French-descended migrants was still detectable in essentially every single one of them, all the way through. And this is the detail that upended a much older theory. Researchers had long debated whether Celtic languages arrived in Britain during the Iron Age, the era normally associated with all things Celtic, or far earlier, at the very start of the Bronze Age. This Bronze Age migration predates the classic Latin cultural expansion by centuries, meaning the genetic foundation for what we now think of as Celtic Britain was already in place before Celtic culture, in the archaeological sense, had even fully emerged. In other words, the genes got there first. The swords, the art, the language, those came later, layered on top of a population that had already been reshaped by migration generations earlier. Geneticist David Reich, whose lab led this work, has been blunt about what that means for how we reconstruct the past. That a study of this scale shows the power of combining large genetic data sets with archaeology to extract detail from a period that otherwise left no written record at all. It wasn't only Britain that got reshuffled either. The researchers described this shift as part of a much broader trend. Early European farmer ancestry was becoming more genetically similar across Central and Western Europe during that same Middle to Late Bronze Age window, coinciding with waves of contact and movement that stretched well beyond the English Channel. Britain wasn't an isolated case of one country getting invaded. It was the edge of a much larger continental churn, one that was quietly blending populations from Iberia to the Rhine long before anyone was carving Latin swirls into a sword hilt. Let's pause and recap, because this is the point where the whole picture starts to reshape itself. So far, we know that a huge migration from France remade half the genetic ancestry of southern Britain hundreds of years before the Iron Age culture we call Celtic fully took shape there. We know the old idea of one Celtic homeland sending out one wave of genetically identical people does not match what's actually sitting in the DNA. And now we're about to head 300 kilometers southeast into Germany, into the burial mounds of people who were not ordinary Iron Age farmers at all. They were the elite, the princes, the people the word Celtic was practically invented to describe. Between roughly 616 and 200 BCE in what is now southwestern Germany, a series of extraordinary burial mounds went up. Sites like Eberdingen-Hochdorf and Asperg-Grafenbühl filled with gold jewelry, imported Mediterranean bronze vessels, and in one case, an entire ceremonial wagon. Archaeologists have called the occupants early Celtic princes for over a century, because if the word means anything, it should mean these people. In 2024, a team led by Joscha Gretzinger and Stephanie Schiffels at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology finally sequenced their DNA, publishing their results in Nature Human Behavior. They analyzed genomic and isotope data from 31 individuals across this early Celtic context in southern Germany, dating between 616 and 200 BCE, and found multiple biologically related groups spanning 3 elite burial sites, as far as 100 kilometers apart. Here's where the part that connects it all together gets genuinely strange. Among the most striking discoveries was a close biological relationship between 2 of the richest burial mounds of the Hallstatt culture, with Bayesian modeling pointing to an avuncular relationship between the 2 individuals buried there, a pattern suggesting matrilineal dynastic succession among early Celtic elites. Translated out of the jargon, the researchers found that the prince buried at Hochdorf and the prince buried at Asperg were uncle and nephew, but related to each other through the female line. The sister of the Hochdorf prince was the mother of the Asperg prince. As Schiffels put it, once every alternative scenario had been tested and ruled out, uncle and nephew through the maternal side was the only explanation that fit the ages, the burial dates, and the shared DNA. Gretzinger explained that this pointed to political power in this society, most likely being inherited through biological succession, comparable to a dynasty, and that the team appeared to be looking at a broad network among the Celts of this region, in which political power was underpinned by biological kinship. That single detail rewrites a huge assumption in Weon. Iron Age Celtic Europe has always been imagined through a Roman lens, a warrior aristocracy, fathers passing crowns to sons, on a world where women appear only at the edges of the story. The DNA says the opposite was, at least here, closer to the truth. Power moving quietly down the maternal line, an entire elite network stitched together by mothers, sisters, and daughters rather than by fathers and sons. And it wasn't isolated to one mound. The study also found evidence of broader familial networks among the Celtic elites in Baden-Württemberg, with relationships detected not just between the 2 primary mounds, but reaching all the way to the more distant Magdalenenberg mound, built roughly a century earlier. Now here's the part that connects Germany to Britain in a way nobody was expecting. This same female-centered pattern of power and inheritance doesn't stay confined to one set of German burial mounds. It shows up, again, independently on an island 400 miles away, among people who left no gold, no wagons, no princely titles at all. In southern Britain, in Dorset, there's a late Iron Age tribe the Romans called the Durotriges. In January 2025, a team led by geneticists Laura Cassidy and Professor Daniel Bradley at Trinity College Dublin published a study in Nature analyzing genomes from Durotrigian burial sites. 1. They analyzed 57 ancient genomes from these burial sites and found an extended kin group centered around a single maternal lineage, with the unrelated individuals in the cemetery, presumably people who had migrated in from elsewhere, being predominantly male. That's matrilocality, women staying rooted in their home community generation after generation, while men were the ones who moved to join their wives' families when they partnered up. The researchers described this exact pattern as previously undescribed in European prehistory. And when they compared mitochondrial diversity across European archaeological sites spanning 6,000 years, British Iron Age cemeteries stood out for having a marked reduction in diversity, driven specifically by the presence of these dominant maternal lines. And this wasn't a one-off cemetery either. Bradley and his team went back through data from earlier genetic surveys across Britain and kept finding the same shape of society repeating. In Yorkshire, hundreds of miles from Dorset, a single dominant maternal lineage had already been established before 400 BCE, centuries earlier, in a completely different Iron Age community, with no obvious connection to the Durotriges at all. 2 Roman writers, Julius Caesar among them, had described Celtic women in Britain and Gaul with a kind of surprise, almost admiration, at how much social and political weight they seemed to carry compared to Roman norms. For 2,000 years, historians treated that as Roman exaggeration, maybe even a bit of exoticizing propaganda about the barbarians at the edge of empire. The bones say the Romans might have simply been describing what they actually saw. So here's where all 3 threads tie together, and it's worth saying it plainly because this is the actual headline underneath all the individual discoveries. A massive Bronze Age migration from France, reshaping half of southern Britain's ancestry, centuries before the word Celtic applied to anything there. A dynasty of German Iron Age princes whose power passed down through their mothers and sisters. A tribe in Dorset where the women stayed and the men who married in were the outsiders. None of these 3 populations share a single unifying genetic thread that would let you draw a neat circle around the Celts and say, this is what a Celts DNA looks like. What they share is language, art, and cultural practice, spreading, evolving, and blending across dramatically different populations who were, genetically, doing their own thing the entire time. Now, to be clear about what this research does and does not prove, because this is where a lot of pop science coverage overreaches, and it's worth slowing down here. None of these 3 studies claim that Celtic, as a cultural or linguistic label, is meaningless. Quite the opposite. All 3 papers work from the position that Celtic languages and Celtic material culture are real, traceable historical phenomena. What they push back on is the older assumption that a shared culture must mean a shared bloodline. It's also worth being precise about scale. The Hochdorf-Asperg study analyzed 31 individuals. The Durotriges study analyzed 57. These are landmark sample sizes for ancient DNA work. A decade ago, sequencing even a handful of usable Iron Age genomes was a major achievement, but they are still snapshots, not a full census of every Iron Age community across Europe. A specific pattern found at Winterbourne Kingston in Dorset does not automatically apply to every Iron Age settlement in Britain, let alone in Gaul or Iberia, and researchers are careful to say that matrilocality being detected at multiple sites strengthens the case without proving it was universal. It's also worth separating population-level evidence from individual-level proof. Geneticists can say with real confidence that roughly half the ancestry of Iron Age, England and Wales, traces to migrants from France as a population-wide statistical pattern. But that is not the same as being able to trace any single-named historical figure's ancestry with certainty. No famous Celtic king from a Roman text has actually had his remains identified and tested. And matrilocality itself, researchers are careful to note, doesn't automatically prove female political power across the board. It describes where people lived and who they were related to, which is a strong signal, not an ironclad guarantee of who held actual authority in every household. If you've made it this far, you've already got a more accurate picture of Iron Age Europe than most museum placards will give you. That alone is worth a share with anyone who's ever said, I'm part of Celtic, like it's a checkbox on a form. There's also a question worth sitting with before we close this out. If Celtic was never one bloodline, then what actually made someone Celtic to the people living it at the time? The honest answer, based on everything the DNA is showing us, is that it was never about ancestry at all. It was language. It was the swords you carried and the God you buried. You're dead to please. It was which side of a burial mound your grandmother's grandmother came from. Genetically, the woman buried in Dorset and the prince buried at Hochdorf might have had almost nothing biologically in common. Culturally, they were speaking cousin languages, carving cousin art, living inside a shared world that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the edge of the Alps. That world was real. It just wasn't built out of blood. It was built out of everything blood can't carry. Memory, custom, story, the things that people choose to pass down rather than the things they simply inherit. So think back to that boy under the mound, day in Germany, and that woman in the Dorset cemetery surrounded by centuries of her own mother's line. They never met. They likely never even heard of each other's world. And yet historians spent 2 centuries calling them the same people for reasons that had almost nothing to do with what their DNA actually says. Science finally caught up to the bones. Tell me in the comments, which surprised you more, that Iron Age political power in Germany passed down through the mother's side, or that Dorset's Durat Reges kept their women rooted for generations, while the men were the ones who had to leave home?